Now allow me this, please, if you will. If you've watched all or part of this Netflix docuseries on the Dallas Cowboys, America's team, the gambler and his Cowboys, buckle up now because I'm about to unleash on it. And I'm not sure there's anyone out there in better position to unleash on it because I was the only one who was inside all of it, but objectively inside it, as in 1 foot in and always 1 foot out, an outsider on the inside, if you will, giving me the best perspective to see the big picture that Jerry and Jimmy and Troy and Barry and Michael and Emmett and Dion and Charles Haley just couldn't step back and focus on. So if you've seen the doc, you know I serve as a sort of narrator commentator through all of the 8 episodes because I did write 3 books that went way behind the scenes with the Dallas Cowboys, books that came out in 1990 and 1993, and finally in 1996. Was I ever blessed to be at the rightest place at the rightest time? Whew. Because as you see in the doc, those teams through the 90s were the most controversial and fascinating teams in the history of sports. That is the objective truth. I dare you to tell me otherwise. So now I'm about to share with you my biggest, strongest, deepest conclusions after I carefully watched this doc. So first, allow me to say that my final takeaway was just to sit back and smile and shake my head. I cannot begin to express to you how much negativity I withstood from fans and from media when each of my 3 books first came out. You want to talk about controversial? Whew. And now talk about vindication and validation. Look, I realize nobody in the world cares about this but me, but this entire documentary vindicates and validates what I was the first to report in each of those 3 books. I'm sorry, that's just the truth. I reported what nobody was ready to hear at that moment. In each case, I wasn't right on time. I was actually ahead of my time in all 3 cases, as you can see in the doc. My first book was called God's Coach. It was about the rise and the fall of Thomas Wade Landry, leading to Jerry Jones buying the team and firing Coach Landry. And as you probably know, Coach Landry wasn't just revered in Cowboy Nation, he was worshipped. And for me to report that in those final 3 years of Landry, he was just losing it, forgetting plays and players' names during games, well, Cowboy Nation just wasn't ready to read that. Fans weren't ready to hear that owner Bum Bright despised Tom Landry, despised him so much, the Landry who wouldn't even give Bright the time of night at Christmas parties, that Bum Bright chose by far the lowest bid for the Dallas Cowboys because the lowest and least qualified bidder, Jerry Jones, the outsider, was the only bidder who said he'd fire Tom Landry. That's the only way Jerry bought it, is that he lucked into saying, oh, I don't want to go forward with Tom Landry. And for me, this is the only in Dallas irony of this whole tale, is that Jerry Jones told Bum Bright he was bringing in his good friend Jimmy Johnson to coach the Cowboys, the same Jimmy that Jerry would soon be calling that motherfucker, as he does in the documentary. Only in Dallas. Much of what I first reported in God's Coach is in this doc, but the media pretty much scoffed at God's Coach. They hadn't reported it, so it couldn't be true. And by the way, God's Coach was my favorite of my 3 books. it's the inside truth from start to finish about that entire franchise history. Allow me to say this, I'm just not sure I'm capable of reporting and writing at a higher level than I did in God's Coach. But the other two books had bigger, better stories to tell. But before I leave God's Coach, understand I spent so much time interviewing Jerry Jones for God's Coach that I got to know him before most of the media did. Maybe all the media did. I really got to know him. And I must admit, I liked him. And I think I was the only media member in Dallas who began to predict in my newspaper columns that Jerry Jones, who was ridiculed in those days as Jethro Jones, the hick from the Arkansas Sticks, that Gerald Wayne Jones would do great things in Dallas. I was a proponent of Jerry's. I was a defender. I campaigned that this was going to work because Jerry was going to drive it home. And did he ever? So my biggest takeaway on Jerry Jones is that I can't help it. I still like the heck out of him. He obviously can be just runaway egomaniacal, as you see in the doc. He's turned into a stubborn old coot, just irrationally stubborn. And he's obviously the owner who will never, ever fire his general manager himself. And Jerry, weirdly but truly, does not know or get football. I'm sorry, that's the truth. Yet, in the end, it's hard for me not to like Jerry Jones, who has the best and biggest heart of anyone in that documentary. And in the end, is weirdly the most likable figure in that doc, although Barry Switzer is a close second. So, before I knew it, my publisher of my first book, Simon & Schuster, was asking me to do a second book, a season inside a team that was just on the verge. You just knew it was on the verge, a very talented but too young team, the 1992 Dallas Cowboys. And guess what that book turned into? It sort of wrote itself. It ran away from me. It turned into Jerry versus Jimmy, behind the scenes. I was there. That book was ironically titled The Boys. Not really. That book ends with a prediction that the town wasn't big enough for the both of them, that they wouldn't last much longer together, that either Jerry would fire Jimmy or Jimmy would just up and quit. Of course, that 92 team broke through a year early and won the Super Bowl. And now I was coming out with a book that predicted the owner would fire the head coach. A book that was competing in bookstores with that head coach's. Ain't I a great book about how he had turned everything around from 1-15. In fact, his book, Jimmy's book, was called Turning the Thing Around. What? Lord have mercy on me. Cowboy Nation was not happy with me. None of this had been reported until I reported it, even though everything I wrote in that book was dead on the money. You can see it now. Nobody wanted to see it then. Nobody wanted to hear it then. Nobody. Even my book editor initially took exception with my opening scene in that book. You can check it out if you so desire. But it was Jerry blowing through the locker room door after the final regular season game of 1992. Just as Jimmy was addressing the team, here came Jerry leading Prince Bandar, Saudi Arabia's ambassador to the United States. Prince Bandar and his entire entourage, including all the security, right through the door and into the post-game locker room. And my opening scene had Jimmy stopping in mid-sentence as he spoke to the team and storming out of the locker room and throwing a fit and threatening to quit right then and there, and finally cursing out Jerry later that evening at a post-game gathering for coaches upstairs in the stadium. Cursed him out. All that happened before the 92 playoffs even got started. I'm just not sure my editor really ever believed it was that bad between Jimmy and Jerry. My editor initially wanted me to lead that book with Jimmy blowing up at the team on the plane coming back from a December loss in Washington, a story that had already been reported, but one that added fuel to the blazing legend that had become Jimmy Johnson, the national legend of Jimmy Johnson. At that point, Jimmy was at least as big a national star as Troy or Emmett or Michael had become up to that point as they first broke through. But my editor's sure right about one thing. Cowboy Nation did not want to hear anything about Jimmy versus Jerry, even though I just knew that was the story. But Cowboy Nation's reaction to the boys was, what? This is more outlandish shock jock lies from Skip Bayless. It got so bad for me after that book came out in July, just ahead of the next year's training camp, the 93 training camp, that around, I don't know, is the 1st of September, I was on the Sunday morning show on ESPN, The Sports Reporters, Dick Schaap show, the late, great Dick. When on air, I reiterated that I just doubted Jimmy and Jerry would last much longer. And in the next commercial break, my producer came on the speaker that everyone in the studio could hear and just, with a booming voice of God, just called me out, just laughed at me in front of everybody, said I was crazy if I truly believed Jerry Jones was going to fire the hottest coach in pro football, Jimmy Johnson. What is wrong with you? And I shrugged and I said, I know what I've seen. I had seen Jimmy ban me from all Cowboy facilities for daring to give Jerry any credit in my book. And by the way, I definitely gave Jerry credit for ramrodding that trade with the 49ers for Charles Haley, a trade Jimmy was hesitant to make because he feared Charles was just uncoachable. As I said in that book, and as everybody says now, no way the Cowboys win that Super Bowl without Charles Haley. And now Troy Aikman, as he said the other night on Monday Night Football, he says that he wouldn't have any of his 3 rings without Charles Haley. I second that emotion. And on opening day of camp in 1993, I had seen Jerry make a beeline right past Jimmy standing out in the middle of the practice field and come straight over to me standing on the sidelines and say to me, as long as I own this team, you will be welcome in all of our facilities. That's what Jerry Jones said to me. Yes, sir, I had seen Jerry show Jimmy who was boss in full view of all the players and many media members standing along the sideline. But of course, the Cowboys won a second straight Super Bowl in 1993, and I guess I looked like a complete idiot for a little while until shortly thereafter at the league meetings, Jerry decided he'd finally had enough of Jimmy's ridicule and scorn, and he fired his ass. Look, this is just me. Final takeaway, Jimmy's a scoundrel. He's a con artist. He's a media deceiver. In the end, deep down, not a nice guy. I didn't think the documentary went quite deeply enough into how many times in front of assistant coaches and other front office staffers, Jimmy just shamed Jerry to his face, just shamed him for trying to play GM and for taking credit and for doing so many interviews. Jimmy could not stand it that he had paid his coaching dues starting as an assistant at Picayune, Mississippi High School, and that Jerry had struck it rich and bought his way into owning and operating an NFL team. Really, owning and operating the NFL team. Look, I certainly appreciated that from Jimmy. I got it. But here's what Jimmy really couldn't live with. This is it. This is the crux. as long as he coached the Dallas Cowboys, he would have a boss. He was never going to be the boss. And Jimmy could only shame that boss so many times, especially in front of assistant coaches that Jerry admired and wanted to kind of be part of that assistant coach fraternity, one of the boys. Look, I've said many times that Jimmy Johnson could create a locker room force field unlike any coach I have ever been around, and I've been around a bunch of great ones. Jimmy could create a force field out of which championships could spring, create a force field that kept players on razor's edge because they were scared to death of Jimmy's psycho temper. He could create a force field that was finite, that might have lasted maybe a couple of more years in Dallas because, look, that force field was going to burn him out along with all the players and all the coaches and everyone else around Hurricane Jimmy. It was going to be finite, and maybe it had already run its course after 2 Super Bowls. But here's the point. I'll say this again. Jimmy's football acumen wasn't all that much greater than Jerry's. Jimmy didn't believe in Troy Aikman for the first 3 years he had him. First 3 years, Jimmy drafted Steve Walsh number 1 in the supplemental draft. Jimmy stuck with Steve Berline at quarterback down the stretch of the 91 season and into the playoffs, even after Troy Aikman got healthy. Norv Turner was Jimmy's 8th attempt to hire a new offensive coordinator, and it was Norv, who was only the receivers coach with the Rams, who turned around Troy's career. How lucky was Jimmy to stumble into hiring Norv? Seriously, how lucky? Whew. Which brings me to my last Cowboys book, Hell Bent, perfectly titled. The season-long story of how Aikman was trying to get Barry Switzer fired because Barry didn't crack the whip the way Jimmy cracked it. And Switzer and his allies fighting back with all their proud might. Look, here's what I never understood about Troy. And there's a big part of Troy I really like to this day. But this is what hit me hard as I watched the documentary. Why couldn't Troy, as the supposed team leader, see what was going on inside that locker room and get on board with Barry Switzer? Because everyone in that locker room had come to love Barry Switzer, would run through the locker room walls for Barry Switzer. Trust me, you can see it in the documentary. All of them except for the quarterback, who kept losing his mind because Barry wasn't Jimmy. The same Jimmy who once called Troy a loser and who drafted Steve Walsh and who stuck with Steve Berline and who only grudgingly came around to Troy because Norv Turner convinced him to. What? Friends have asked me if Troy had some deep-seated, lingering animosity toward Barry because of what happened when Troy played for Barry at Oklahoma. I really don't think so. Look, Barry tried to fit square peg Troy into his round hole triple option wishbone attack. I mean, Troy was a drop back passer. He just didn't fit in the wishbone. And Troy's leg got broken, ironically, against Jimmy's Miami Hurricanes in Norman fairly early in the year. And Barry eventually got on the phone and found Troy a new drop-back passer home with Terry Donahue at UCLA. Barry did that, went way out of his way for Troy. Barry liked Troy. I don't know yet. During that 1995 season, Switzer became convinced that Troy was trying to turn 2 key media opinion makers in Dallas, Dale Hansen and Randy Galloway, against Barry. That was very true. So imagine how Barry Switzer felt when Troy had really his 2 worst games of the year, both times against the rival Redskins, who were on their way to finishing 4-12. That's right. The Dallas Cowboys on their way to a Super Bowl championship lost twice that year to the eventual 4-12 Redskins coached by Norv Turner. The coach Troy obviously wanted to replace Barry Switzer. Whew, imagine what Switzer was thinking. It was a long, hard year for Barry Switzer. It took a lot out of him, and it actually took a lot out of me because was I ever caught in the crossfire between Aikman and Switzer, between the Aikman camp and the Switzer camp, and all their supporters in and around the organization. Their relationship ended over a sideline incident during that second Redskins loss that was at Texas Stadium on December the 3rd, fairly late in the year. Look, I knew Troy could be a hothead. I'd experienced that several times myself, but I had forgotten how Troy could just profusely lose it on the sideline. You can see it in the doc. Man, that sideline footage, I guess from NFL films, some of which I had not seen before. So during that second Redskins loss, Kevin Williams, a little slot receiver and kick returner, didn't run a route the way Troy wanted, a route Kevin Williams hadn't run correctly during what Troy thought was yet another undisciplined Barry Switzer practice. And on the sideline that day, Troy just unloaded on Kevin Williams. And the assistant head coach at the time, John Blake, who's about to become the new head coach at the University of Oklahoma, told Barry Switzer that Troy had just crossed the line. Details are all in my book. And as the doc points out, Switzer had a secretary call Aikman that night, set up a meeting at 9 a.m. in Switzer's office. You can read it in Hellbent. Switzer told Aikman that either Troy was going to apologize to the team when the players came in at noon, or Switzer would apologize for Troy. And as Aikman told me for the book, he just got up and walked out of the office. And as I reported in Hellbent, the quarterback and the head coach of the Dallas Cowboys did not speak a word from December the 4th through the Super Bowl that the Cowboys won in spite of themselves. It was unprecedented, it was unheard of, and it was the truth. Hellbent became a searing psychological study of the internal war between the superstar quarterback who went to high school in Henrietta, Oklahoma, and the legendary Oklahoma coach who so badly wanted that quarterback who played for him in college to love him in Dallas the way every other Cowboy loved Barry Switzer. Whew. Truth. And now it's all there in this documentary. As I said in the doc, Aikman versus Switzer that season became unbearable for that team. Michael and Emmett backed me up on that in the doc. But listen, when Hellbent first came out that July, I got blasted by fans and by media. What? Aikman versus Switzer? They just won the Super Bowl. What are you talking about? Even if some media members knew some of this was going on behind the scenes, none of it had ever been reported, so they all scoffed at and discredited my book, maybe just to save face, their own face. Nobody involved with the Dallas Cowboys has taken anywhere near the criticism that Jerry Jones has, but let me say, I might at least be in Jerry's ballpark for taking heat. God has put me in some great places in my career, but in situations that have fire-tested my faith in God and ultimately my faith in myself. Each time, God has given me the strength to hang in, endure, and each time I have survived and I have prevailed. Thank you, God, for my vision and my courage. It's all from you. And now, thank you for this documentary, for the vindication and the validation. Now, if only Jerry at age 82 could be vindicated and validated by winning one last Super Bowl.